All right, hello again, students, and welcome back one more time here to CHRTC 309. So, of course, this is, and probably always will be, the sociology of youth and religion. Okay, so in this lecture, building off sort of the last one, we're going to follow the same cohort that was followed in that first wave of the National Study of Youth and Religion that found that our religious teenagers had better life outcomes. We're going to follow them into emerging adulthood and see how they've changed, right? Because they haven't all stayed the same. And B, get a sense of whether this positive life outcome pattern held for emerging adults.
So when looking at the results of the National Study of Youth and Religion, broadly speaking, what Smith and Patricia Snell said was that on the whole, when you kind of lump people together by their religious tradition, there isn't a real difference in life outcomes for particular faiths, right? So evangelicals, Catholics, mainline Protestants, Black Protestants, Latter-day Saints, Mormons, Jews, Muslims, whatever, didn't seem to correlate to better life outcomes. And basically they said this is because within particular religions, there is a lot of diversity as to who is dedicated, who is not, right? So basically, being Catholic doesn't correlate to better life outcomes, and being evangelical doesn't correlate to better life outcomes in general. What seems to play a role is level of dedication to faith. It is the people who are more dedicated to faith than others who have the better life outcomes. Okay, so in their study of basically the same group of people 5 years on, Smith and Snell used the same categories that Smith and Denton used 5 years earlier. So we have the devoted. The devoted now are only 5%, down from 8 in the original sample. The regulars, are 14%, down from 27% in the original sample. The sporadic up by about a percentage, and the disengaged, who were in the original sample were about 12%, are up to 25.5%. And those are still the categories that we'll be working with. So one of the questions, obviously, that comes out of that first wave of data is, will that positive kind of life outcomes last, into adulthood for those teenagers who are having positive life outcomes when they were, in their teens and religious? And what Smith says is the differences between the groups, right, the devoted having better life outcomes, is broadly still present to some extent in the third wave of data. Some of the kind of spread has narrowed a little bit, but it's still basically there. Okay, so when it comes to their parental relationships, 5 years on from those teenage years, basically what we see is in this wave of data, the devoted still had, broadly speaking, better relationships with their parents than the people in other categories, and often markedly so, right? So 88% of them felt extremely close to their mother, as compared to 71 of the disengaged and the sporadic, and 75% of the regulars. Get along extremely well with mother, basically 83% of the devoted versus 71% of the disengaged, 72 and 70% of the regulars. Talks to mother about personal subjects, 35% versus 20%, and on again, right? Like, feels their mother understands them very much, right? 60% of the devoted, only 36% of the disengaged. Feels extremely close to their father, right? 64% for the devoted, 49% for the disengaged. And, again, broadly, there's not as big of a difference for getting along extremely well with their father, 68 versus 60. Talk to their fathers about personal subjects. Obviously, a big difference there between mothers and fathers, 12%, but only 6% in the disengaged. Feels that their father understands them, 41 versus 26. And fewer of them had experienced parental breakups as compared to the all the other categories, right? There's a fairly big spread between the devoted and all of the other categories. So, basically, broadly speaking, better relationships with their parents across the board. Okay, so when it comes to social engagement, broadly speaking, the religiously devoted were tied into a greater number of groups at about 2.4 compared to 1.2 for the disengaged and 1.8 for the regulars and the sporadic each. They tended to be involved in more organized activities sponsored by religious organizations, not including worship or youth group. So no real surprise there. They tended to be involved in about the same or slightly less activities not sponsored by a religious group. Less likely to use a social networking site, right? They were the least likely here to use a social networking site at 46 or 69%, sorry. And they visited social networking sites less than their peers. So basically, they were more engaged out in the real world and less engaged on social media. In terms of like their moral orientation, right? Significant differences again between the devoted and those who were disengaged, but even the regulars and sporadics, right? So basically, when they were asked, if they believe it's okay to break moral rules if it works to one's advantage and you can get away with it, only 4% of the devoted said that it was versus 22% of the disengaged, and then 10 and 17 for the sporadics and the regulars, respectively. The belief that morals are relative, and again, that's not to say that one answer is right or wrong, but the belief that morals are relative tends to give people a lot more leeway to act in different ways. And so what we see here basically is, only 16% of the devoted said they were versus 63% of the disengaged and 40 and 52 in the other two categories. Okay, so what can we say about that? I think what's clear is that in terms of moral reasoning, whatever you believe about the ways that these groups reason morally or what that potentially means, they reason morally very differently, right? There are huge differences between the way that these groups think. And I think that's worth noting, right? That basically when it comes to moral reasoning, there is a huge spread and a huge difference in the way that people who are religiously devoted think about kind of morality as compared to those who are disengaged. And I mean, when we talk about these other kind of three next categories, right? Let's kind of circle them here broadly. What we can say is that on the whole, they tended to, say that they cared much more about, equality between racial groups, more about the needs of the elderly, and more about the needs of poor people than people in any of the other categories who struggled to get above 50%. Of people saying that they cared. And even when they did, what you see at the end of the day, right, is it's only the regulars, so people who are somewhat religious at the end of the day, who said that they basically cared, more than half of them cared about the needs of, in this case, the elderly and the poor. So again, big differences in the orientations of these different groups in terms of moral questions. And I think that matters tremendously. Okay, so when we look at risk behaviors, right, similar to that first wave of data at the end of the day, what we can say is, when it comes to all sorts of risk behaviors, drinking alcohol weekly or more, right, only 11% of the devoted said they drank alcohol weekly or more as compared to 48% of the disengaged and the sporadics, both at 48%, and still a significantly higher number of the regulars, right, at 28%. So a big difference there. When we talk about binge drinking, and binge drinking is a particularly dangerous and harmful behavior, one with a lot of negative health consequences, and a lot, it raises the odds of things like, being sexually assaulted, being assaulted in general, all sorts of things that binge drinking is broadly speaking a bad indicator for. Only 3% of the devoted said that they had been binge drinking 3 or more times in the last 2 weeks. So that's quite a lot. But 90% said they were never binge drinking. Okay, so about a quarter of the disengaged and about a quarter of the sporadics both said that they had been binge drinking 3 or more times in the last 2 weeks, and far fewer of them said never, right? Only about 40% for both. And then we've got our regulars, kind of definitely lower than the sporadics and the disengaged, right, at 12 and 58%, but still more likely than the devoted to binge drink, and less likely to say that they never binge drink. If we look at their percentage of their closest friends who do drugs or drink a lot, right? Again, the devoted had far fewer, and no surprises here, friends who drink a lot, only 16%, a third for the regulars, and nearly half for the sporadic and the disengaged. So a lot more friends partaking in risk behaviors, which means you're more likely to be around it. Smoking cigarettes weekly or more. We're going to put this one in red, right? So weekly or more, only 1% of the devoted said they smoke cigarettes weekly or more, versus over a quarter of, the disengaged, over a quarter for the sporadics, and a fifth for, the regulars still. And then again, like 90% of the devoted said they never smoke, versus like 3/4 for our regulars, and then about 60% for the other two categories. When it comes to marijuana, despite the fact that it's fairly normalized, it obviously has a lot of negative consequences for things like brain development, especially in teenagers and young adults. And basically, for the ones, the 5% that said they were devoted, none of them said that they used marijuana weekly or more, and 98% said that they had never used it. And this is compared to, nearly a fifth of the disengaged who said they used marijuana weekly or more, and I guess 58%, which is still not bad, who said they had never used it. Getting into fights, the spread here isn't as big, right? Has been in a serious fight more than once in the last 2 years. What we can say here, I need a different color. I'll grab dark blue. Again, the devoted were the least likely to have been in a serious fight at 12%. Versus 26%, 28% for the sporadic. So apparently being sporadic means you're more likely to fight. But there's actually not a whole lot of statistical difference between the bottom three categories there. 27, 28, and 26 is within kind of margin of error. Okay, and basically, they were the least likely to say that they like taking risks. So again, our risk-averse personality, we might have some reverse selection bias in there. 2/3 said they like to take, only 2/3 said they like to take risks, as opposed to 3/4 in the regulars and the disengaged, and almost 80% or 4/5 in the sporadics. So big differences in terms of risk behaviors, right? And I think that says something significant again. And this may speak to that reverse selection bias we were talking about last time, where those who are religiously devoted are more likely to be risk averse, and therefore probably more likely to have good life outcomes, at least in the short term. Okay, so in terms of their physical and mental and spiritual well-being, right? Again, we can see significant differences between the categories. In terms of would they rate their physical health as good or excellent? 79% of the devoted versus 50% or 58% of the disengaged. That's not that's still a 20%, 21% spread, so that's a fairly big one. In terms of their body weight, so more of them, 2/3 had a normal body mass index versus just over half for the disengaged. And fewer of them were overweight than the disengaged. Although here the categories are obviously a little mixed because the sporadics were lower at 9%. And so there may not be something inherent in terms of the way that the devoted are, but apparently there are some life practices that they're undertaking that are a bit more healthy. They tended to feel better about their own body, right? So 82% said they were very or somewhat happy, as opposed to just about 2/3 of the disengaged. And fewer of them, like the lowest percent, said that they were unhappy, right? Only 11% compared to 23% for the disengaged, and kind of middling for the other two categories. So fairly statistically significant differences there. Thinking about future plans, right? There's not a huge disparity across the board there. Nothing, I mean, it is significant, right? There is a 8% spread between the devoted and the disengaged. But obviously the majority in all categories are thinking about the future, and not many think about the future, rarely or never. There's still a 3% spread between the devoted and the disengaged. Thinking about the meaning of life though, right, here's a big spread. Almost 2/3 of the devoted versus less than a third, or almost a third of the disengaged, and then kind of less than half for both other categories. And then, thinking about the meaning of life, rarely or never, 10% of the devoted said that, versus almost a third of the disengaged, and basically almost a third of the sporadics. And then, even at our regulars, only a quarter. Now, I mean, this is kind of interesting, right? And it may just be that these people are young, and not particularly inclined to think about the meaning of life. That may be something. And we do know that people kind of at the other end of life do tend on the whole to be a little bit more reflective about that sort of thing. But still, you see a significant 30% spread between young people who say they think about life often in terms of the devoted between them and the disengaged, roughly a 30% spread. And then, those who say rarely, like basically they don't think about the meaning of life very often, 10% of the devoted versus, a 23% higher at 33% for the disengaged. So there is a difference in terms of how they make sense out of life. And so is it good to think about the meaning of life? Probably. You do tend to do more of that metacognitive work, and some of that work, that when you run into times of trouble, it looks like the devoted will have done some of that metacognitive and kind of spiritual reasoning that other people may not have done, and may leave them in a position, like a better position overall. Okay, so a few more here. We're kind of getting close to the end, and I'm sorry to just talk through the charts like this. I can't think of a better way to do it. Okay, so when you look, do they feel sad or depressed, or rarely or never feel sad or depressed? We see a 10% spread between the devoted and the disengaged, but still like a significant spread in terms of about 5% between the devoted and the sporadics. 2% between, the regulars and the devoted. That's sort of within the margin of error. So that could just be, I think they've controlled for a lot of that, but it's still within the margin of error, so it's not huge. But basically, right, it looks like those who are more devoted tend to feel less sad and depressed. How often do they feel life is meaningless, right? I mean, here, again, a big spread. What we get between the devoted, 88% say they never feel life is meaningless versus 74%. So, 14% spread there. That's a big spread. That's a big difference, definitely outside of the margin of error. So, it's a fairly statistically significant statistic, or even those who say they often feel that it's, or fairly often feel that life is meaningless, 2% for the devoted, 6% higher for the disengaged, and that's definitely outside the margin of error for a study of this size. They're more likely to feel loved or accepted. I am running out of colors on this slide. Let's take that one. Feel loved or accepted, right? So 82% versus 69. So that's a big spread. And then the other two categories are even at 76, but still outside the margin of error. So the devoted are more likely to say they feel loved or accepted. They're less likely to say they never feel invisible. How often they feel guilty about things? They feel guilty about things. This makes me laugh. Having grown up Catholic, right? The devoted and the regulars are far more likely than the sporadics in particular, or the disengaged, to feel guilty. Or yeah, a little bit. And then, rarely or never, basically they're far less likely to say that they feel guilty rarely or never than the other two categories, which I do think is kind of funny. And I mean, kind of across the board, one of the things we can say that I do think is fairly interesting here is that if we look at it, they basically kind of roughly equivalent in terms of how often they've experienced traumatic events. So it's not just devoted have had happy-go-lucky lives. Everybody seems to have, basically, the differences here are not huge. But basically, everybody seems to have had roughly even traumatic experience across the board. So I do think that's interesting. So what's the takeaway from this? A whole range of well-being kind of measurements for our devoteds that are just a little bit better. And it's not always huge differences, but they're differences and they're outside the margin of error for the most part. So we can say is, being kind of spiritually engaged does, at the end of the day, seem to make a difference. Okay, so, when we look at life satisfaction, again, we see pretty big spreads here, and very much in the favor of those who are, religiously, in that religiously devoted category, right? So we talked to, is life close to ideal, right? wow, 86% of the devoted said they feel life is close to ideal, compared to only 63% for the disengaged, which is big. Life conditions of life are excellent, 88%, versus 70%, and even in that middle category, far lower scores for the regulars and the sporadic. Do they feel satisfied with their personal life? Yeah, they do. 94% said they felt satisfied with their personal life, which is a 9% difference over the disengaged. And it's still significant differences with the regulars and the sporadics. Have gotten the important things in life. Again, a pretty good spread here, 82% versus 65, and 12-ish point kind of difference between the other two categories. I can so do math quickly in my head. And so their overall life satisfaction score, they scored better on the life satisfaction score than the other categories. Okay. And they were the only one significantly higher than the average. Okay, so basically what can we say? Again, when it comes to life satisfaction, apparently being part of that religiously devoted cohort makes a difference. People who are religiously devoted are more likely to be happy with their lives. Okay, so there are fairly obvious ways, like just looking at these stats, that the religiously devoted are different from the other emerging adults that were studied in the National Study of Youth and Religion. It looks like they're doing better, right? Moving through the teenage years into emerging adulthood than some of their less religious peers. They're across a whole bunch of measurements. They're just doing better. Now, that's a really difficult thing to say, in a sense, right? Because it's not clear how it helps us. If we wanted to improve people's life satisfaction, obviously, it'd be great to have something that's prescriptive. But you can't say to someone, go and become religious, right? In a sense, it's like you are or you aren't. It might be possible for someone, say, to engage in spiritual practices. It's not clear what it would take for them to move into that sense of being religiously devoted, right? It's not always something necessarily that it's obvious people just choose to do, right? You can't necessarily, I think, just choose to be religious. Now, you can choose to act, in religious ways. Is that the same thing? Now, there's certainly people who have been trying this out, right? Like you have increasing kind of reports, they're anecdotals, they're not, statistics of, basically atheists who go to church every week, who basically like just try to go through the motions of religion, basically with the sense that, yes, there is something to this, even though I don't believe there's a God. Whether that causes higher life satisfaction is unclear, but it seems obvious that like some of the community benefits, those 9 cultural factors that we talked about in the last lecture, that tend to improve people's lives, that this does matter overall. But it's not like you can be like, okay, as you're transitioning from teenage years into emerging adulthood, you should really be religious for that period, and then what, right? Because it's not like you can just tell people to be religious. So there's so much more that goes into it, obviously. You can suggest, again, like I said, people try out spiritual practices, and maybe that would be the prescription, is like, well, try acting like you're religious. I don't know. It's probably a terrible idea at the end of the day, and we'll see what happens in terms of life outcomes. Obviously, that's extremely difficult to measure. Statistically, that would be something that would be super interesting if someone could figure out how to actually study it. Because you have to do it on a fairly wide scale, right? You have to get a whole bunch of people to agree to, say, like, meditate or pray, even if they don't believe in God. And obviously, it's kind of a heavy lift. So it's unclear how this helps us, but it is interesting information, right? There is a big difference between those who are religiously devoted and those who aren't. And it's pretty consistent across categories, right? It's not like in one category they're up, in one category they're down. They're pretty much either at the average or above the average in most categories. Okay, so here is our second online discussion activity, for this last portion of the course. I want you to basically I'll create a forum for this on eClass, and you're going to answer the question, what's your problem with the idea that the most religious teens and emerging adults have the best life outcomes? Like, do you have a problem with this statement? Or can you see flaws in the argument? Is there something about it that kind of niggles at you, bugs you, that you kind of would like to give voice to? Okay, and if you feel like it, and no pressure here, it could make for an interesting kind of discussion. But obviously, I know it can be awkward commenting on other people's things, especially in a class where you kind of know people. But go ahead and take a look at the answers given by your peers, And if you feel like it, comment on one or two of them. Have fun with it, right? It's in place of classroom discussion, which I'm really missing in this class. It's really unfortunate that it had to go this way. But yeah, if you could do that, and obviously that counts towards your participation grade.